evening! Good evening! You ready for it to get spooky? I got this all set up. A nice little spooky evening here. Fuck you. It's Halloween, bitch! I don't have to go to sleep. Here, actually. There we go. I don't have to sleep. It's Halloween. It's my anniversary. I get to stay up as long as I want. We're reading tonight. It's Edgar Allan Poe. I don't even know what story should we start off with. So many here. I'm so right, though. You can tell me what to do. They're just jealous. Hi, King. Welcome. I guess good morning to you. Halloween's over there, but we've still got 30 minutes of it, and then we're gonna drag it out a little bit longer. You can even probably hear it if I have my physical copy of Edgar Allan Poe ready to go. I have some mood music too. I try and remember. Here, hold on, actually. I got some spooky ambiance for tonight. You still got an hour and a half, I don't. If I have a lot of work to catch up on. Well, we'll have plenty of time to catch up on work. So, as I said before, it's Halloween, and Halloween is very special to me. And I almost forgot to put the text overlay up. Whoops. As you can see, I have been preparing. And I have today with me my big book of Edgar Allan Poe, because I feel like we haven't had a classical reading stream in a while, and this is a good chance to get that in. So today, I'm going to start off reading one of my favorites. Let's see. I think we'll start off with my favorite. BRB in 2 minutes. No, that's fine. Go. Go enjoy yourself. Alright. So begins our tales. We're going to start off with one of my favorites, The Masque of the Red Death. Let me get to the page here. This is a big, thick book, so it takes me a while to get anywhere I need to go. Page 119. There we are. Alright. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains were upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victims. Were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid of the world, and from the sympathy of fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy, and dauntless, and sagacious, when his dominus were half depopulated dominions. I don't know why I said dominus. Dominions. Were half populated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends. from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to deep seclusion of one of his castled abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in, its wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the court might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve, or to think. The prince had provided all appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security were within, without the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long, straight vista, while the folding doors slide back neatly to walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different. As might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre, the apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. Looking back, there was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right, left, and in the middle of each wall, a tall, narrow, Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. I love it. It's almost like me. If I open my eyes large enough. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here were panes of purple. The third was a green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black. Velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emanating from a lamp or a candle within the suite of the chambers. In the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, and so glaringly illuminated the room and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precedent at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce can't read tonight ceased their evolutions. And there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedated passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled, as if their own nervousness and folly had made whispering vows, each to each other, that the next chiming clock should produce them no similar emotion, and then after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embrace 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came another chiming of the clock, and then there were the same disconcerted and tremulous of meditation as before. Can you tell that it's been a while since I've read Poe? It's been forever since I've read Poe. Oh well. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The taste of the Duke was peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of 7 chambers upon occasion of great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter, and piquancy and phantasm, much of what had since been seen in Heronon. There were I always struggle with these words. God damn it. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of terrible, and not a little of that which might. See, I'm getting myself tripped up. Where did I leave? Oh no, I've lost my place. Oopsies. Where did I go? And not a little of that which might have excited disgust. Too, and not a little of that which might have... Fuck, I did it again. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the room and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock, It stands in the hall of velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still. All is silence save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now, again, the music swells, and dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. To the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away. And there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the nearby clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly empathetic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirling on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. And then its music ceased. As I have told, the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the ball of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps that more thought crept with more time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled, and thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, horror, and disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, whom life and death are equally just, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger, neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to toe in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, closest scrutiny might have had difficulty in detecting the cheats. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His venture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. I don't know how long we're gonna go, but I'm gonna try and go for at least like an hour or two. Whenever we stop, we're gonna read at least like a good chunk of stories. I plan on it, at the very least. You're good though. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon his spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment, with a strong shudder of either terror or distaste. But in the next, his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first he spoke. There was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand. And now, deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe to which the mad assumptions of the mummer had been inspired, the whole party there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person. And while the vast assembly, as if one of impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to violet, ere a decided movement had been made upon to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers. While none followed him on account of the deadly terror that had seized upon all, he bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadows of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave sacraments and corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violent a rudeness, unattended by a tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had once come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bewetted halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last gay, and the flames of the tripod expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. I figured we'd start off with that one. It's about the same reading time as finishing off for the night, since that is, we've only got 5 minutes until the end of Halloween. We're gonna keep it going past, though, of course. Happy Halloween! Happy Halloween, chat! Thank you for the resub, my bud. It's been a good Halloween. I hope you're having a good one. Hold on, why is that not updating? What should we read next? Let's see. We'll just come in and chill out, relax, get a nice little relaxation. Let's see what we're gonna read next. How about we read? Yeah, sure. What's up? Before we start the next one, what's your question? I am not. I was at one point. I was in school for criminal justice and psychology. But I am no longer. I know that might sound a little bit weird. But I never finished school, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Let's see. How about... Just realized this book doesn't have the raven. You mean, how did I find the stories that we're reading? I actually have a slight collection of older horror fiction. I like to collect horror in general. It's kind of like my, one of my hobbies in general. So I have this, I have a complete work of, Kafka. Yeah, it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, there's always opportunities elsewhere, too. I might go back to school at some point, but you know. I have, some Kafka. I also read, I have a set... Oh, my courses. Oh, oh gosh. I had been thinking about going to that school in particular for a while. And they were one of these schools, that I had been looking at for those particular courses. I had always had college in mind. So it wasn't like super out of the ordinary. At least not for me. Let's see, how about we read... I don't want to read Fall of the House of Usher. We can read Telltale Heart. Telltale Heart's always a quality read. Let me pull it through here. But nah, I collect big, I have a literature collection. I actually have a bunch of, like, old editions of books. I have I want to say it's like a second or third edition of Lord of the Rings series, like a whole collection of it. And then I also have, my favorite book that I have in my collection is actually a, I want to say it's like a 1920s copy of the Grimm's Fairy Tales that's fully illustrated. And fully intact, too, which makes me very happy. Alright. So we have the Telltale Heart. I like books. I really do. I don't read as much as I should, but I do like books. Alrighty. True. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? Disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed. Not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. Oh, you should definitely read Frankenstein. Or if you've already had, I'd totally remember to revisit it. I love Shelley's works. I heard all things in heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe, healthily, how calmly, I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with the foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, at about midnight, I turned the latch to his door and opened it oh so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him and that he lay upon his bed. Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well within the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, cautiously. For the hinges creaked. I undid it just so that the single ray of light fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights. Every night, just at midnight, but I found the eye was always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work. For it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name, hearty tone, and inquiring how he's passed in the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than mine did. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own prowess, of my sagacity. It scarcely contained my feelings to triumph. To think that there I was opening the door little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Well, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch, with thick darkness, for the shutters were closed and fastened, for fear of robbers, and so I knew that he couldn't see me through the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in, and I was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quiet and still, and I said nothing. For the whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening the death watches in the walls. Presently I heard a slight groan, and knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not the groan of pain or of grief. Oh no! It was the low, stilted sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and I pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since that first slight noise when he had turned upon bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney, it is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which makes a single chirp." Yes, he's been trying to comfort himself with all of these suppositions, but he found all in vain, all in vain. His death in approaching him had stalked with his black shadow before him, and enveloped the victim, and it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down. I resolved to open a little, very little, crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. I cannot imagine how stealthily, until, at the length of a single dim ray, like the thread of a spider, shot out from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and it grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness. All a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the rays, as if by instinct, precisely on the damned spot. And now I have not told you that what you might mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the senses. Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when being enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of the drum stimulates a soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could to maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for the minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by the neighbors. The old man's hour had come, and with a loud yell I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. Then I smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it. There many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eyes would trouble me no longer. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took in concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence first of all. I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chambers, and I deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash up, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for this. A tub had caught it all. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock. Still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking on the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by the neighbors during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. Took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. It was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt, I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much in such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly and more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with a violent gesticulation, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise rose steadily and increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder! And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder, louder, louder. Villains, I shrieked. Dissemble no more, I admit the deed. Tear up the planks here, here, here is the beating of his hideous heart. And that was The Telltale Heart. It's been a while since I've read that one. It's always been a favorite of mine. And again, I think it's a lot of people's favorite. I will have to look up. I think we're going to end the stream when we do end it. It's going to be a whiles away. And I think when we do end it, we're going to end it with the Raven. Which is not, surprisingly, in this specific book. Which I thought it was, but I was wrong. It does not have, it's not the complete works. But it is a good chunk of the works. This book actually has a lot of preamble. And it goes over a lot of the reasoning for which stories they put in here. I didn't expect that the Raven would be here until the last moment. So I apologize. We're gonna when we read at the end, I'll have to look it up on online to read, which won't be very difficult. Because it's a very, very popular one. So, what to read next? So, the one that I think I'm going to read next, I think Casca Amontillado is probably a good one to do. Wait, no! Hop Frog! We should read Hop Frog. Hold on. I love Hop Frog. Have you guys ever heard Hop Frog before? Sit up straight. Unshrimp myself. Ugh. I'm very shrimped up. I always like reading these because I get to get really into it. Alright. Hop Frog. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. Tell a good story of the joke kind, and to tell it well, was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rara avis interis. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghosts of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for the breadth in jest, and would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties wearied him, and he would have preferred Rabelais' Gargantua to the Zagged of Voltaire, and upon the whole practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion at court. Several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore a motley of caps and bells, and who were expected to be always ready with sharp wittiness, and at a moment's notice in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of fact, of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however. His value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his being also a dwarf and a cripple. Dwarfs were common at court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days are rather longer at court than elsewhere, without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at. But as I have already observed, your jesters in 99 cases out of 100 are fat, round, and unwieldy, so that it was no small source of self-gratulation that our king, that in Hop Frog, this was his fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. Hey, Kaylin, welcome in. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent of several ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectional gait, something between a leap and a wiggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement, and of course consolation to the king, for, notwithstanding a protuberance of his stomach and constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted a capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could move only with great pain and difficulty along the road or floor, the prodigious Muscular power, which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by the way of compression for deficiency in the lower limbs, enabled him to perform many feats of wondrous dexterity. Where trees or ropes were in question or anything else to climb, as such exercise he certainly had much more resembled a squirrel or a small monkey than a frog. I'm not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came from. It was from some barbarous region, however, that no person ever heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king, Hop Frog, and a young girl very little less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and a marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent as presents to the king by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy aroused between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular. Had it not in his power, lost my place for a second, rendered Tripita many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted. So she possessed much influence and never failed to use it, whenever she could, for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forgot what, the king determined to have a masquerade, and whenever a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at court, then the talents of both Hop Frog and Tripetta were sure to be called into play. Hop Frog, in especial, was so inventive in his way of getting up pageants suggesting novel characters and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seemed, without his assistance. The night appointed for the fete had been arrived. A gorgeous hall had been fitted up under Tripetta's eyes, with every kind of device which could possibly give éclat to masquerade. The whole court was in a fever of expectation. As for the costumes and characters, it might as well have been supposed that everybody had come to a decision on such points. Many had make-up on their minds as to what roles they should assume. A week or even a month in advance, and in fact, there was not particle of indecision anywhere, except in the case of the king and his 7 ministers. Why they hesitated, I never could tell, unless they did it by the way of joke. More probably, they found it difficult on account of being so fat to make up their minds. At all events, time flew, and as a last resource, they sent for Tripetta and Hop Frog. When the two little friends obeyed the summons, king, they found him sitting at his wine with 7 members of his cabinet council. The monarch appeared to be in very ill humor. He knew that Hop Frog was not fond of wine, for it excited the poor cripple almost to madness, and madness is no comfortable feeling. But the king loved his practical jokes, and took pleasure in forcing Hop Frog to drink, and as the king called it, to be merry. "Come here, Hop Frog," said he as the jester and his friends entered the room. "Swallow this bumper to the health of your absent friends." Here Hop Frog sighed, "And then let us have your benefit of invention. What characters! Characters! Man, something novel out of the way. We are wearied with this everlasting sameness. Come, drink. All the wine will brighten your wits." Hop Frog endeavored as usual to get up in jest to reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to drink to his absent friends forced tears to his eyes. Many large bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant. Roared the latter as the dwarf reluctantly drained the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do? Why, your eyes are shining already." Poor fellow, his large eyes gleamed rather than shone. The effect of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked round upon the company with half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And out of business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, Hopfrog, lend us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters. All of us." And this was seriously meant for a joke. His laugh was chorused by the 7. Hopfrog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractedly, for what he was quickly bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring!" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that? I perceive. You are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this!" And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say," shouted the monster. Or by the fiends. Such a weird break in the book there. The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Geppetta, pale as corpse, advanced to the monarch's seat, and falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments, in evidence wondered at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss for what to do or how to say, how becomingly to express his indignation, at last without uttering a syllable. He pushed her violently from him, threw the contents of the brimming gold goblet in her face. The poor girl got up as best she could, and, not daring even to sigh, resumed her position at the foot of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which falling of a leaf or a feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh, protracted grating sound, which seemed to come from once every corner of the room. What are you doing to make that noise?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have been recovered in a great measure from his intoxication, and looked fixedly, but quietly, into the tyrant's face, and merely said, How could it be me?" "The sound appeared to come from without," observed one of the courtiers. "I fancy he was a parrot at the window wetting his bill upon the cage wires." "True," replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion. "But on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn that it was the gritting of this vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king was so confirmed to a joker to object to anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceivable ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, and with spirit, into plans for the masquerade. "Cannot tell what was the occasion of the association of the idea," he observed very tranquilly, as if he had never tasted wine in his life. "Just after your majesty had struck the girl and thrown wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the windows, there came into my mind a capital diversion. One of my own country frolics, often enacted among at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires company of 8 persons, and here we are!" cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. 8 to a fraction, and I, my 7 ministers. Come, what is the diversion?" "Call it," replied the cripple, "the 8 chained orangutans, and it's really excellent sport if well enacted." "We will enact it," remarked the king, drawing himself upon and lowering his eyelids. "The beauty of the game," continued Hopfrog, "lies in the fight and occasions among the women." "Capital!" roared in chorus the monarch and his ministry. "I will equip you as orangutans," proceeded the dwarf. "Leave all that to me. The resemblance should be so striking that the company in the masquerade will take you for the real beasts, and of course they will be much terrified and astonished." "Oh, this is exquisite!" exclaimed the king. "Hop Frog, I will make a man of you." "The chains are for the purpose of increasing confusion by the jangling. You're supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers. Your Majesty cannot conceive the effect produced at the masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be the real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries. Among the crowd, the delicacy and gorgeously habited by men and women, the constant, inimitable." "It must be," said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as it was growing late, to put in execution of the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, very rarely been seen in any part of the civilized world, and as imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like, and more than sufficiently hideous, and their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in a tight-fitting sockiness shirt and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, someone of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more effectively represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coating of tar. A long chain was now procured. First, it was passed about the waist of the king and tied. Then about another of the party, and also tied. Then about all successively, in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete, and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in two diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adopted by the present day for those who capture chimpanzees and other large apes in Borneo. The grand salon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun through only a single window atop. At night, the season for which the apartment was specially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight and lowered or elevated by means of counterbalance, as usual. But in order to not look unsightly, this ladder passed outside the cupola and above the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Tripetta's superintendence, but in some particulars, it seems, she had been guided by the other calmer judgment of her friend, the dwarf. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it was quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses of the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the salon, could not all be expected to keep out of its center. That is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional sconces were set in various parts of the hall, out of the way, and a flambeau emitting sweet odor was placed in the right hand of each of the Caradites that stood within the wall, some 50 or 60 altogether. The 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders, before making their appearance. No sooner had the clock ceased striking, however, that they rushed, or rather rolled in altogether. For the impediment of their chains caused most of the party to fall and to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee. As had been anticipated, there were not a few of the guests who were supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be the beasts of some kind, in reality, if not precisely, orangutans. Many of the women swooned with affright, and had not the king taken precaution to exclude all weapons from the salon, his party might have soon deepenated their frolic in their own blood. As it was, a general rush was made for the doors, but the king had ordered them locked and immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestions, the keys had been deposited with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive to his own safety, for in fact there was much real danger from the pressure and excitement of the crowd. The chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, and which had now been drawn upon its removal, which had been very gradually to descend, until its hooked extremity came within 3 feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends had reeled about the hall in all directions, found themselves at length in its center, and of course, in immediate contact with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed closely at their heels, inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain, the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically, and at the right angles. Here, with rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had been wont to depend, and in an instant, by some unseen... Oh, what was that? Luna! You came right at the end of Frog. Hi, welcome. I'm Iris. I'm a little demon VTuber, and I hope you have a good night. I read a lot, and I play a lot of different stuff, so I hope you stick around and enjoy your time here. This also reminds me to take a sippy sip. Thank you for the raid. I hope the rest of your stream went good. By some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn so far upwards as to take the hook out of reach, and the inevitable consequence to drag the orangutans together in close connection, face to face. Thank you. I bet you're exhausted. I love Hop Frog. I wanted to read it. Oh, and King, thank you for the follow. I greatly appreciate it. To drag the orangutans together in one close connection, and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-contrived pleasantry set up by the loud shout of laughter and predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through the din. "Leave them to me. I fancy I know them. If I can only get a good look at them, I can tell you who they are." Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get to the wall, when seizing a flambeau from one of the Herodites, he returned as he went up to the center of the room, leaped with the agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and thence clambered a few feet up the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are." And now, while the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, a jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle, and the chain flew violently up for about 30 feet, dragging with it the dismayed and struggling orangutans, and leaving them suspended in mid-air between the skylight and the floor. Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down towards them, though endeavoring to discover who they are. So thoroughly astonished were the whole company at this ascent, that the dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued, was broken by just a low, harsh, grating sound, as had attracted the attention of the king and his counselors, when the former threw the line in the face of Geppetto. But on the present occasion, there could be no question as to whence the sound issued. It came from the fang-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground them and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared, with an expression of maniacal rage, into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. Aha, said at length the infuriated jester. I begin to see who these people are now. Here, pretending to scrutinize the king more closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him, and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely. Amid the shrieks of the multitudes who gazed at them from below, horror-stricken, and without the power to render themselves the slightest assistance. The end of the flame suddenly increased in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain, to be out of their reach, and he made this movement. The crowd began to sink. For a brief instant into silence, the dwarf seized his opportunity and once more spoke. I now see distinctly, he said, what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy councillors, a king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 councillors who abet him in the outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hopfrog the Jester, and this is my last jest. Owing to the high combustibility of both the flax and the tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made it to the end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses swung in their chains, a fetid blackened hideousness, an indistinguishable abyss. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared through the skylight. It is supposed that Geppetta, stationed on the roof of the salon, had been the accomplice of her friend in the fiery revenge, and that, together, they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was seen again. Yay! Murder is deserved. It's one thing about Poe that I really like in stories like these, where you feel like it was a deserved vengeance. Sippy sips. Alright. Like I said, we're going to be ending off the stream specifically with the Raven, but that's not going to be for a little bit. I know Luna brought up a specific story when we were having our little discussion earlier when we were doing our collab. And I actually have it here. The facts in the case of M. Valdemar, which I actually haven't read this one, so we have it handy here, so we might as well read it. I have it right here. There we are. This book is like, I barely touched this book and it smells so good. It's got that new book smell. I love it. Alright. Here we go. The facts in the case of M. Valdemar. Of course, I shall not pretend to consider it any matter of wonder that the extraordinary case of M. Valdemar has excited discussion. It would have been a miracle had it not, especially under the circumstances, the desire of all parties concerned to keep the affair from the public, at least for the present, or until we have further opportunities for investigation. Though our endeavors to effect this, a garbled or exaggerated account made its way into society and became the source of many unpleasant misrepresentations, and naturally, of a great deal of disbelief. It is now rendered necessary that I give the facts, as far as I comprehend them myself. They are succinctly these. My attention for the last 3 years has been repeatedly drawn to the subject of mesmerism, and about 9 months ago it occurred to me quite suddenly, in a series of experiments made hitherto, there had been very remarkable and most unaccountable omission. No person had yet been mesmerized in articulo mortis. It remained to be seen first, whether in such condition there existed in the patient any susceptibility to the magnetic influence. Secondly, whether, if any, existed, was impaired or increased by the condition. Thirdly, to what extent and for how long a period. Just real quick before we continue, I feel the need to point this out. If you don't know what mesmerism is, mesmerism was a spiritual practice done in the revivalist movement. It involved a lot of work with magnetism and hypnotism, as well as the idea of being overcome with spirits. It's very interesting. There's an entire podcast that you can listen to. I think it's by Aaron Mahnke, who does lore. If you're invested in maybe learning a little bit more about that, I would totally check it out. They have an entire thing on the spiritualist movement. It's really interesting. Just wanted to bring that up before we do anything else, because I really like the story that you get out of that. Okay, where did I leave off? There are other points to be ascertained, but these most excited my curiosity. Last and especial from the immensely important characters of its consequence. In looking around me for some subject by whose means I might test these particulars, I was brought to think of my friend M. Ernest Valdemar, the well-known compiler of the Bibliotheca Forensica, can't read, and author under the nom de plume of Edgar Marx, the Polish version of Wallenstein and Gargantua. M. Valdemar, who has resided principally at Harlem, New York, since the year of 1839, is or was particularly noticeable for his extreme spareness of his person, his lower limbs much resembling those of John Randolph, and also those of the whiteness of his whiskers, in violent contrast to the blackness of his hair. The latter, in consequence, being very generally mistaken for a wig. His temperament was markedly nervous, and rendered him a good subject for mesmeric experiment. On 2 or 3 occasions I had put him into sleep with little difficulty, but was disappointed in other results, such as his peculiar constitution had naturally led me to anticipate. Oh, my nose is getting a little funky. His will was no period positively or thoroughly under my control, and in regard to clairvoyance, I could only accomplish with him nothing to be relied upon. I also attributed my failures to these points to disordered state of his health. For some months previous to my becoming acquainted with him, his physician had declared him in confirmed phthisis. It was his custom, indeed, to speak calmly of his approaching dissolution, and as of a matter neither to be avoided nor regretted. When the idea to which I had alluded first occurred to me, it was the very course of natural that I should think of M. Vanderman. I knew the steady philosophy of which the man too well to apprehend any scruples from him. He had no relatives in America who would be likely to interfere. I spoke to him frankly upon the subject, and to my surprise, his interest seemed vividly excited. I say to my surprise, for although he had already yielded his person freely to my experiments, he had never before given me any tokens of sympathy with what I did. His disease was that of character, which would admit of exact calculation in respect to the epoch of its termination of death, and it was finally arranged between us that he would send for me in about 24 hours before this period announced by his physicians that of his disease. My nose. It is now rather more than 7 months since I received from Mr. M. Valdemar himself the subjoined note. My dear P., you may as well come now. D and F are agreed that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow midnight, and I think they have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar. I received this note within half an hour after it was written. In 15 minutes more, I was in the dying man's chambers. I had not seen him for 10 days, and was appalled by the fearful alteration that the brief interval had wrought him. His face wore a leaden hue, his eyes were utterly lustrous, and the emaciation was so extreme that the skin had been broken through by the cheekbones. His expectoration was excessive. His pulse was barely perceptible. He retained, nevertheless, in a very remarkable manner, both his mental power and a certain degree physical strength. He spoke with distinctness, took some palliative medicines without aid, and when I entered the room, was occupied by penciling memoranda in a pocketbook. He was propped up in the bed pillows. Doctors D and F were in attendance. After pressing Valderman's hand, took these gentlemen aside and obtained from them a minute account of the patient's condition. It was supposed to be minute, but I can't read. The left lung had been for 18 months in a semi-osseous and these are medical terms. Cartilaginous state, and was, of course, entirely useless for all purposes of vitality. The right, in its upper position, was also partially, if not thoroughly, ossified, while the lower region was merely a mass of purulent tuberculars. Tubercles? Yes. Running one into another, several extensive perforations existed, and at one point, permanent adhesion to the ribs had taken place. These appearances in the light rose were of comparatively recent date. The ossification had proceeded with unusual rapidity. No sign of it had been discovered a month before, and the adhesion had only been observed during the 3 previous days. Independently of the phthisis, the patient was suspected of aneurysm of the aorta, but on this point, the osseous symptoms rendered an exact diagnosis impossible. It was the opinion of both physicians that M. Valderman would die at about midnight on the morrow, Sunday. It was then 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. On quitting the invalid's bedside to hold conversations with myself, Doctors D and F had bidden him a final farewell. It had not been for their intention to return, but at my request they agreed to look in upon the patient about 10 the next night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with M. Valderman on the subject of his approaching dissolution, as well as the more particular of the experiments proposed. He still professed himself quite willing and even anxious to have it made, and urged me to commence it at once. A male and a female nurse were in attendance, but I did not feel myself altogether at liberty to engage in a task of this character with no more reliable witnesses than these people, in the case of some accident might provide. I therefore postponed operations until about 8 the next night, when the arrival of the medical student with whom I had acquaintance, a Mr. Theodore L.I., relieved me from farther embarrassment. It had been my design originally to wait for the physicians, but I was induced to proceed, first, by the urgent entreaties of M. Valderman, and secondly, by my main conviction that I had not a moment to lose, and he was evidently sinking fast. Mr. L.I. was so kind to accede me in my desire that he would take notes of all that occurred, and from it, his memoranda, that I now have to relay this, for the most part, either condensed or copied verbatim. It wanted about 5 minutes of 8 when taking the patient's hand. I begged him to state distinctly what he could to Mr. L.I., whether he, M. Valderman, was entirely willing that I should make the experiment mesmerizing him, and then his condition. He replied feebly, yet quite audibly, "Yes, I wish to be mesmerized," adding immediately afterwards, "I fear you have deferred it too long." While he spoke thus, I commenced and passed which I had already found most effectual in subduing him. He was evidently influenced for the first lateral stroke of my hand across his forehead, but although I exacted my powers, no farther perception A perceptible effect was induced until some minutes after 10 o'clock, when Doctors D and F called. According to appointment, I explained to them in a few words what I had designed, and as they opposed no objection, saying that the patient was already in death's agony, I proceeded without hesitation, exchanging, however, the lateral passes for downward ones, and directing any gaze entirely into the right eye of the sufferer. By this time his pulse was imperceptible, and his breathing was stertorous and in intervals of half a minute. This condition was nearly unaltered for a quarter of an hour. At the expiration of this period, however, a natural, although a very deep, sigh escaped the bosom of the dying man, and the strenuous breath ceased. That is to say, its strenuousness was no longer apparent. The intervals were undiminished. The patient's extremities were of an icy coldness. At 5 minutes before 11, I perceived unequivocal signs of mesmerizing influence. The glassy roll in the eyes was changed for the expression of uneasy inward exclamation, which is never seen except for cases of sleepwalking, and which it's quite impossible to mistake. With a few rapid lateral passes, I made the lids quiver, as in incipient sleep. With a few more, I closed them altogether. I was not satisfied, however, with this, but continued the manipulations vigorously, with the fullest exertion of will, until I had completely stiffened the limbs of the slumberer, after placing them in seemingly easy position. The legs were at full length, the arms were nearly so, and reposed on the bed at moderate distance from the loins. The head was very slightly elevated. When I had accomplished this, it was fully midnight, and I requested the gentlemen present to examine M. Valdemar's condition. After a few experiments, they admitted him to be in an unusually perfect state of mesmeric trance. The curiosity of both the physicians was greatly excited. Dr. D resolved at once to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. F took leave with the promise to return at daybreak. Mr. L. I. and the nurses remained. When left, M. Valdemar entirely undisturbed until about 3 o'clock in the morning, when I approached him and found him in a precisely the same state of condition as when Dr. F went away. That is to say, he lay in the same position. The pulse was imperceptible, the breathing was gentle, scarcely noticeable unless through the application of a mirror to the lips. The eyes were closed naturally, the limbs were as rigid and cold as marble. Still, the general appearance was certainly not that of death. As I approached M. Valdemar, I made a kind of half-effort to influence his right arm into pursuit of my own. As I passed the ladder, gentle, to and fro above his person. And such experiments with this patient had never perfectly succeeded before, and assuredly I had little thought of succeeding now. But to my astonishment, his arm very readily, although feebly, followed every direction. I assigned it with mine. I determined to hazard a few words of conversation. "M. Valdemar," I said, "are you asleep?" He made no answer, but I perceived a tremor about the lips, and was thus induced to repeat the question again and again and again. At its third repetition, his whole frame was agitated by a very slight shivering. Eyelids unclosed themselves so far as to display a white line of ball, the lips moving sluggishly, and from between them a barely audible whisper issued the words, "Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die so." I here felt the limbs and found them as rigid as ever. The right arm had, as before, obeyed the direction of my hand, and I questioned, sleepwalker again. "Do you still feel pain in your breast, M. Valdemar?" The answer was now immediate, but less audible than before. "No pain. I am dying." I went on an adventure there. My model just decided to go wherever the fuck it wanted. What the fuck? I went on a little adventure. Whoops. I did not think it advisable to disturb him farther just then, and nothing more was said or done until the arrival of Dr. F., who came in a little before sunrise, and expressed unbounded astonishment at finding the patient still alive. After feeling the pulse and applying mirror to the lips, he requested me to speak to the sleepwaker again. I did so, saying, "M. Valdemar, do you still sleep?" As before, some minutes elapsed ere a reply was made, and during the interval, the dying man seemed to be collecting his energies to speak. At my fourth repetition of the question, he said very faintly, almost inaudibly, "Yes, still asleep, dying." It was now the opinion, or rather the wish, of the physicians that M. Valdemar should be suffered to remain undisturbed in his present apparent tranquil condition until death should supervene. And this, it was generally agreed, must now take place within a few minutes. I concluded, however, to speak to him once more, and merely repeated my previous questions. While I spoke, there came a marked change over the countenance of the sleepwaker. The eyes rolled themselves slowly open, the pupils disappearing upwards. The skin generally assumed a cadaverous hue, resembling not so much the parchment as white paper, and the circular hectic spots within hitherto had been strongly defined in the center of each cheek, went out at once. I use this expression because the suddenness of their departure put me in mind of nothing so much as the extinguishment of a candle by a puff of breath. The upper lips at the same time writhed itself away from the teeth, which it had previously covered completely, while the lower jaw fell with an audible jerk, leaving the mouth widely extended and disclosing in full view the swollen and blackened tongue. I presume that no member of the party then present had been unaccustomed to deathbed horrors, but so hideous beyond conception the appearance of M. Valdemar at this point, that there was a general shrinking from the region of the bed. I now feel that I have reached the point in this narrative at which every reader will be startled into positive disbelief. It is my business, however, to simply proceed. There was no longer a faintest sign of vitality in M. Valdemar, and concluding him to be dead, we were consigning him to the charge of the nurses. A strong vibratory motion was observable in the tongue. This continued for perhaps a minute. At the expiration of this period, there issued from the distended and motionless, it's a weird page turn, jaws of a voice, such as it would be madness in me to attempt describing. There are, indeed, 2 or 3 epithets which might be considered applicable in part. I might say, for example, that the sound is harsh and broken and hollow, but the hideous whole is indescribable, for the simple reason that no similar sound ever jarred upon the ears of humanity. There were 2 particulars, nevertheless, which I thought of then, and I still think might fairly be stated as characteristic of the intonation, as well adapted to convey some idea of its unearthly peculiarity. In the first place, the voice seemed to reach our ears, at least mine, from a vast distance, or from some deep cavern within the earth. In the second place, it impressed me, I fear indeed, that it will be impossible to make myself comprehend, as gelatinous or glutinous matters impress to touch the sentence. I have spoken both of sound and of voice. I mean to say that the sound was one of distance, and I have of even wonderfully thrilling, distinct syllabification. M. Valdemar spoke. Obviously, in reply to the question I had produced to him a few minutes before. I had asked him, and he remembered if he still slept. He now said, "Yes. No, I have been sleeping, and now I am dead." No person present even affected to deny or attempt to repress the unutterable shuddering and horror which these few words, thus uttered, were so well calculated to convey. Mr. L.I., the student, swooned. The nurses immediately left the chamber, and could not be induced to return. My own impressions I would not pretend to render intelligible to the reader. For nearly an hour we busied ourselves silently, without an utterance of a word, in endeavors to retrieve Mr. L.I. When he came to himself, we addressed ourselves again to the investigation of M. Valdemar condition. He remained in all respects as I have last described, the exception that the mirror no longer afforded evidence of respiration. An attempt to draw blood from the arm failed. I should mention, too, that his limbs were I'm at that point in the night where I can't read straight. That this limb was no farther subject to my will. I would endeavor in vain to make it follow the direction of my hand, the only real indication indeed, the mesmeric influence, was now found in the vibratory movement of the tongue whenever I addressed M. Valdemar a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but had no longer sufficient volition. To queries put to him by another person than myself, he seemed utterly insensible. Although I endeavored to place each member of the company in mesmeric rapport with him, I believe that I have now related all that is necessary to understanding of the sleepwaker's state in this epoch. Other nurses were procured, and at 10 o'clock I left the house in company of the 2 physicians and Mr. L.I. In the afternoon, we all called again to see the patient. His condition remained precisely the same. We had now some discussions as to the propriety and feasibility of awakening him, but we had little difficulty in agreeing that no good purpose would be served by doing so. It was evident that so far death, or what is usually termed death, had been arrested by the mesmeric processes. It seemed clear to us that to awaken M. Valdemar would be merely to ensure his instant, or at least speedy, dissolution. From this period until the close of last week, an interval of nearly 7 months, we continued to make daily calls to M. Valdemar's house, accompanied now and then by medical and other friends. All this time the sleepwaker remained exactly as I have described him. The nurse's attentions were continual. It was on Friday last we finally resolved to make an experiment of awakening or attempting to awaken him. And it is the perhaps unfortunate result of this latter experiment which has given rise to so much discussion in private circles, to so much what I cannot help thinking unwarranted popular feeling. For the purpose of relieving M. Valdemar from the mesmeric trance, I made use of the customary passes. These for a time were unsuccessful. The first indication of revival was afforded by a partial descent of the iris. It was observed as especially remarkable that his lowering pupil was accompanied by the profuse overflowing of a yellowish ichor from behind the lids, of a pungent and highly offensive odor. It was now suggested that I should attempt to influence the patient's arm, as heretofore I made an attempt and failed. Dr. F. then intimidated a desire to have me put a question. I did so as follows. M. Valdemar, can you explain to us what are your feelings or wishes now? There was an instant return of hectic circles on the cheeks. The tongue quivered, rather rolled violently in the mouth, although the jaws and lips remained as rigid as before. And at length the same hideous voice, which I have already described, broke forth. For God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep, or quick, waken me, quick. I say to you that I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant remained undecided what to do. At first I made an endeavor to recompense the patient, but failing in this through total abeyance of the will, I retracted my steps and earnestly struggled to awaken him. In this attempt I soon saw what I should be successful, or at least soon fancied my success would be complete, and I am sure that all in the room was prepared to see the patient awaken. What really occurred, however, is quite impossible that any human being could have been prepared. As I rapidly made the mesmeric passage amid ejaculations of dead, dead, absolutely bursting from the tongue and not from the lips of the sufferer, his whole frame at once within the space of a single minute, or even less, shrunk, crumbled, absolutely rotted away beneath my hands upon the bed, for that whole company there lay in nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity. Yay! That is the facts in the case of M. Valderman. Let's see, what do we want to read next out of this lot? There's so many here. Let's see. There are some ones that we haven't read yet that I think most people would probably regard as classic. Let's see. Don't want to read Fall of the House of Usher, even though that's one of my favorites. Let's see. Castle Amontillado, Pit and The Pendulum. I think what we'll do is we'll read Pit and The Pendulum, and then we'll finish this off with... Maybe we'll do a double? I'll have to look them up real quick, though. Hold on. We can do a double feature and read Lenore and the Raven. So they go hand in hand. I have to find them real quick. There we are. There we are. I have those pulled up and ready to go for when we want to read those. Alright. We'll read the Pit and the Pendulum, and then we will finish off with those two. So where in particular is the Pit and the Pendulum in this book? 126. Ha! That's right, it was right after Masque of the Red Death. Alright. Pit and the Pendulum's pretty short. Shouldn't be too awful long. It's like sandwiched right between Telltale Heart and Masque of the Red Death. I kind of skip around a little bit. Let me unshrimp myself real quick. Stretch. Get me a sip. Alright. Let us begin the Pit and the Pendulum. Impium tortorum longus hic turba furores. Sanguineus innocuae non satitat aluit. Sospite nunc patria fracto nunc funeris antro. Morzubi dira fruct vita saluesque patent. Quanteria composed for the gates of the market to be erected upon the site of the Jacobean clubhouse in Paris. I was sick unto death with that long agony, and when they at length unbound me and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of inquisitorial voices seemed merged on one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of a revolution, perhaps from its association and fancy with the burr of the mill wheel. This only for a brief period, of presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how terrible exaggeration. Saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me wider than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin even to the grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression and firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern, competent, human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from those lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly occlusion, I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw, too, for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of sable draperies, which enwrapped the walls of the apartment, and then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first they wore the aspect of charity and seemed white and slender angels who would save me, but then all at once there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a gallivantic battery, while the angels' forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And then there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came at length properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished, as if magically from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly, and the blackness of darkness supervented. All cessations appeared, swallowed up in a mad rushing descent, as the souls into Hades. Then silence and stillness, and night for the universe. I had swooned, but still I will not say that all of my consciousness was lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define or even to describe. Yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave, all is not lost. Else there is no immortality for man, arousing from the most profound of slumbers. We break the gossamer web of some dream. Yet in a second afterwards, so frail may that web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed, and return to life from the swoon. There are 2 stages. First, that the sense of mental or spiritual. Second, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond that. The gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the 2? But what if the impressions that I have termed the first stage are not, at will, recalled yet? After long intervals, they do not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they came. He who has never swooned is not he who finds strange palaces of wildly familiar faces in coals that glow. Is not he who beholds floating in midair the sad visions that the many may not view. It is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower. It is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before been arrested in his attention. Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul has lapsed, there have been moments in which I have dreamed of success. There had been brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which lucid reason of the later epoch assures me that I cannot have reference only to the condition seemingly unconscious. These shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me, the mere idea of the indeterminableness of the descent. They tell also of vague horror at my heart, on account of the heart's unnatural stillness. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness throughout all things, as if those who bore me, a ghastly train, had outrun in their descent the limits of their limitlessness, and paused from the wearisome of their toil. After this I call to mind flatness and dampness, and all is madness, the madness of a memory which brews itself among forbidden things. Very suddenly, there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. And a pause in which all is blank, then sound again, and motion, and touch. Tingling sensation pervading my frame, then the mere consciousness of existence without a thought, a condition which lasted long. Then, very suddenly, thought and shuddering terror, and earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state. Then a strong desire to lapse into insensibility, and a rushing revival of soul and successful effort to move, and now in full memory of trial, of the judges, of the sable draperies, of the sentence, of the sickness, of the swoon, then entire forgetfulness of all that followed, of all that a latter day and much earnestness of endeavor have enabled me vaguely to recall. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back unbound as I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There I suffered it to remain for many minutes while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but I grew aghast, lest there be nothing to see. At length, with wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts then were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made an effort to exercise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitorial proceedings and attempted from that point to deduce my real condition. The sentence had passed. It appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed. Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead, such as supposition, notwithstanding. What we read in fiction is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and in what state was I? The condemned to death I knew perished usually at the hands of the auto da fe, and one of these had been held on the very night and day of my trial. I had been remanded to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months. This, I at once saw, could not be. Victims had been immediately demanded. Moreover, my dungeon, as well as all the condemned cells at Toledo, had stone floors, and light was not altogether excluded. Fearful idea now suddenly drove in my blood in torrents upon my heart, and for a brief period I once more relapsed into insensibility. Upon recovering, I at once stared at my feet, trembling, convulsing in every fiber. I thrust my arms wildly above me and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step lest I should be impeded by walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood in cold big beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable. I cautiously moved forward, my arms extended, and my eyes straining from their sockets in hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many more paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. I breathed more freely. It seemed evident that mine was not, at least, the most hideous of fates. And now I still continued to step cautiously onward. There came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors, the horrors of Toledo. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated. Fables, I had always seen them, but yet strange, too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper. Was I left to perish for starvation in the subterranean world of darkness? Or what fate, perhaps even more fearful, awaited me? The result would be death, and death of more than customary bitterness. I knew too well the character of my judges to doubt. The mode and hour were all that occupied and distracted me. My outstretched hands at length encountered some solid obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly, with stone masonry, very smooth, slimy, and cold. Followed it up, stepping with all careful distrust which certain antique narratives had inspired me. This process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of my dungeon, as I might make the circuit, in return to the point whence I set out, without being aware of the fact that so perfectly uniform seemed the wall. I therefore sought the knife which had been in my pocket, which led into the inquisitorial chamber. But it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I had thought of forcing the blade into some minute crevice of the masonry so to identify my point of departure. The difficulty, nonetheless, was but trivial, although the disorder of my fancy had seemed first insuperable. That's a word. I tore a part of the hem from the robe and placed a fragment at full length at the right angle of the wall. In groping in my way around the prison, I could not fail to encounter this rag upon completing the circuit. So at least, I thought. But I had not counted upon the extent of the dungeons, or my own weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward for some time. When I stumbled and fell, my excessive fatigue induced me to remain prostrate, and sleep soon overtook me as I lay. Upon awaking and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water. I was too much exhausted to reflect upon the circumstance, but ate and drank avidly. Shortly afterwards, I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil, came at last upon the fragment of serge. Up to the period when I fell, I had counted 52 paces, and upon resuming my walk, I had counted 48 more. When I arrived at the rag, there were all then 100 paces, and admitting 2 paces to the yard, I presumed the dungeon had to be 50 yards in circuit. I had met, however, in many angles in the wall, and thus I could form no guesses as to the shape of the vault. For the vault, I could not help in supposing it to be. I had little object, certainly no hope in these researches, but a vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. First, I proceeded with extreme caution to the floor, although seemingly of solid material, was treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage, and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. I advanced some 10 or 12 paces in this manner when the remnant, the torn hem of my robe, became entangled between my legs. Stepped on it, fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance, which, yes, a few seconds afterwards, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. It was this. My chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head, although seemingly at less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in clammy vapor, and a peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose from my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm at its descent. At least there was a solemn plunge into the water, succeeded by loud echoes. And at the same moment there came a sound resembling a quick opening and a rapid closing of a door overhead, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world would have seen me no more, and the death just avoided was of that very character which I had regarded as fabulous and frivolous in the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victims of tyranny, there was the choice of death with its direst physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral honors, and I had been reserved for the latter. By long suffering, my nerves I had been unstrung until I trembled at the sound of my own voice, and had become in every respect, a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the well, of which my imagination now pictured many various positions. About the dungeon, or in other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once by a plunge into these abysses. But now, it was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read upon these pits, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of their most horrible plan. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length I again slumbered. Upon arousing, I found by my side, as before, a loaf and a pitcher of water. Burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel at a draught. I must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course, I know not. When once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible by a wild, sulphurous luster, the origin of which I could not first determine. I was unable to see the extent, the aspect of the prison. In its size I had been greatly mistaken, for the whole circuit of the walls did not exceed 25 yards. For some minutes this fact occasioned me a world of vain trouble, vain indeed. What could be of less importance under my terrible circumstances which environed me? The mere dimensions of my dungeon? But my soul took wild interest in trifles, and I busied myself in endeavors to account for the error I had committed in my measurements. The truth at length flashed upon me in my first attempt at exploration. I had counted 52 paces up to the period when I fell. I must then have been within a pace or two of the fragment of cirque, in fact. I had nearly performed the circuit of the vault. Then I slept, and upon awaking I must have returned upon my steps, thus supposing the circuit nearly double of what it actually was. My confusion of mind prevented me from observing that I began my tour with the wall to the left and ended it with the wall to the right. I had been deceived, too, in respect to the shape of the enclosure. Feeling my way, I found many angles and thus deduced an idea of great irregularity, so potent in the effect of total darkness upon one arousing from lethargy and sleep. The angles were simply those of a few slight depressions or niches at odd intervals. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed now to be iron, or some other metal in huge places, those sutures or joints occasionally in the depression. The entire surface of this metallic enclosure was rudely daubed in all hideous and repulsive devices, to which the charnel superstitious of the monks had given rise. Figures of fiends and aspects of menace with golden skeleton forms, and others more really fearful images, overspread and disfigured on the walls. I observed that the outlines of the monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, but that the colors seemed to fade and blurred, as if from the effects of the damp atmosphere. I now noticed the floor, too, which was of stone. The center yawned a circular pit from whose straws I had escaped, but it was the only one in the dungeon. All this I saw indistinctly, and by much effort. My personal condition had greatly changed during my slumber. I now lay upon my back, and at full length on the species of low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long, sharp strap resembling a circingle. Circingle? Yes. Passed in many convolutions around my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my left arm to such an extent that I could, by dint of much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay beside me on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed. I say to my horror, for I was consumed with intolerable thirst. This thirst had appeared to be by design of my prosecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat, pungently seasoned. Oh, I'm a little sleep. We're almost there. We only got a few more pages, and then we'll read Raven and Lenore. Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling to my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead and constructed much as the side walls. In one of the panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time as he is commonly represented, save that in lieu of a scythe, he held what at a casual glance appeared to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively. I gazed directly upon it, for its position was immediately over my own. I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterwards, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief and, of course, slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Wearied at length with observing its dull moments, I turned my eyes upon the other objects of the cell. A slight noise attracted my notice, and looking onto the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well, which lay within view of my right. Even then, while I gazed, they came up in troops, hurriedly with ravenous eyes, lured by the scent of the meat. From this, it required much effort and attention to scare them away. Might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, for I could take but imperfect time before I again cast my eyes upward. What I saw then confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, velocity was also much greater. What mainly disturbed me was the idea that the perceptibly descended. That's words. I now observed with what horror it is needlessly to say that its nether extremity was formed into the crescent of a glittering steel, about a foot in length, from horn to horn, horns upward, and under the edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid, broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass. The whole hissed as it swung through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me by monkish ingenuity and torture. My cognizance of the pit had been known. The inquisitorial agents, the pit, whose horrors had been destined for so bold as a recusant as myself, the pit, typically of hell, and regarded by rumors as the ultima thule of their punishment. Plunge into this pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents, and I knew that surprise or entrapment into torment formed an important portion of all the grotesqueries in the dungeon's depths. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan that hurled me into the abyss, and thus, there being no alternative, a different and milder destruction awaited me. Milder! I half smiled in my agony as though at the thought of such application of a term. What boots, it tells me, too long hours, for more than moral, during which I counted the rushing oscillations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down still it came. Days passed, it might have been many days passed, ere it swept so closely over me as I fanned me with an acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed, I wearied heaven with my prayer for it more speedy to descend. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upon it, the sweep of the fearful scimitar. And then I fell suddenly calm, and lay smitten at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. There was another interval of utter insensibility. It was brief, for upon again lapsing into life, there had been no perceptible descent in the pendulum, but it might have been long, for I knew there were demons who took note upon my swoon, and who could have arrested the vibration at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt so inexpressibly sick and weak, as if though long intonation. Then, amid agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. Painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as my bonds permitted and took possession of the small remnants which had been spared to me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. What business had I with hope? It was, as I lay, half-formed thought, man is many such, which are never completed. I felt then it was of joy, of hope, but also that it had perished in its formation. In vain I struggled to perfect, to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary powers of mind. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of heart. It would fray the skirt of my robes. It would return and repeat its operations again and again, notwithstanding its terrifically wide sweep, some 30 feet or more, and the hissing vigor of its descent, sufficient to sunder these very walls of iron, and still fraying my robe would be all that. For several minutes it would accomplish, and at this thought I paused. I dared not go any further than this reflection. I dwelt upon it with pertinacity of attention, as if in so dwelling I could arrest here the descent of the steel. I forced myself to ponder upon the sound of the crescent as it should pass upon the garment, upon the peculiar thrilling sensation the friction of cloth produced on the nerve. Pondered upon all the frivolity until my teeth were on edge. Down steadily, down it crept. Took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity, to the right, to the left, far and wide. With the shriek of a damned spirit, to my heart, the stealthy pace of a tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as one or the other grew an idea of predominance. Down, certainly, relentlessly down. Vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach the ladder from the platter beside me to my mouth, and with great effort, no farther. I could have broken the fastenings above the elbow. I would have seized an attempt to arrest the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down, still, unceasingly, still, inevitably down, I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward whirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaningly despair. They closed themselves spasmodically at the descent, although death would have been a relief. Oh, how unspeakable. Still, I quivered in every nerve to think how slight the sinking of the machinery would precipitate that keen gleaming axe upon my bosom. It was hope that prompted the nerve to quiver, the frame to shrink. It was hope, the hope that triumphs on the rack, that whispers to death's condemned, even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I saw that 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe. And with this observation, there suddenly came over me the spirit of all keen, collected calmness and despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought. Now occurred to me that the bandage, or circingle, which enveloped me was unique. It was tied by no separate cord. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent athwart my portion of the brand would also detach it so that I might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. But how fearful in that case the proximity of the steel! The result of the slightless struggle, how deadly! Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of the torturer had not foreseen and provided this possibility? Was it probable that the bandage crossed my bosom in the track of the pendulum? Dreadful to find my faint, and, as it seemed, in the last hope frustrated, I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my breast. It enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save for the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped into my head back into its original position, when there flashed upon my mind what I can only describe as better than the unfathomable, the unformed half-idea of deliverance to which I had previously alluded, and of which I, moiety, only floated intermittently through my brain when I raised food to my burgeoning lips. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, still entire. I proceeded at once with the nervous energy of despair to attempt its execution. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, and ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited for the motionlessness on my part to make their prey. To what food, I thought? Have they been accustomed in the well? They had devoured in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but in small remnants of the contents of the dish. I had fallen into habitual seesaw or waved the hand about the platter, and at length the unconscious uniformity of the movement deprived it in all effort. In their voracity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp teeth on my fingers, which the particles of oily and spicy viand now remained. I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could to reach it, then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the cessation of movement. They shrank alarmedly back. Many sought the well, but this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their voracity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at this word I can't pronounce. This seemed to be the signal for a general rush, forth from which they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding his strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandages. They pressed, they swarmed upon me in accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my bosom, and chilled, with heavy clamminess, my heart. Yet one moment, and I felt the struggle would be over. Plainly, I perceived, loosening the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must well already be severed. This was more human resolution. I lay still. Nor had I erred in my calculations, nor had I endured in vain. I at length felt that I was free. It hung in ribbons from my body, and strokes of the pendulum already pressed upon my bosom. It divided the serge of the robe. It cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung, and the sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve. But in the moment of escape it arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliveries hurried tumultuously away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the embrace of the bandage, and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free! And in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped away from my wooden bed of horror when the stone floor of the prison, when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was a lesson which I took desperately to heart. My every moment was undoubtedly watched. Free! I had but escaped death in one form of agony to be delivered on to worse than death in some other ways. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change which at first I could not appreciate distinctly. It was obvious, had taken place in the apartment. For many minutes of dreamy and trembling abstraction, I busied myself in vain in connecting conjectures. During this period, I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illuminated the cell. It proceeded from the fissure, about half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison at the base of the walls, which thus appeared and were completely separate on the floor. I endeavored, but of course in vain, to look through some aperture. As I arose from the attempt, my mystery of alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of the figures upon the wall were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors seemed blurred and indefinite. These colors had now assumed they were momentarily assuming a startling and almost intense brilliance that gave the spectral and hellish fiendly portraits an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes of wild and ghastly vivacity glared upon me in 1,000 directions, where none had been visible before, and gleamed with the lurid luster of fire that I could not force my imagination to regard as unreal. Unreal! Even while I breathed, there came to my nostril the breath of vapor-heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted, I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt in the design of my tormentors. Almost unrelenting, almost demonic of men. I shrank from the glowing meal at the center of the cell amid the thoughts of my fiery destruction that impended. The idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like a balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. The glare from the enkindled roof illuminated inmost recesses. Yet for a wild moment, my spirit refused to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length, it force wrestled upon me and my soul, burned itself upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak! Oh, horror! Oh, any horror but this! With a shriek, I rushed from the margin and buried my face in hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased once again, and I looked up, shuddering, as a fit of ague. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the changes were obvious in the form. As before, it was all in vain that I at first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place. But not long was I left in doubt. The inquisitorial vengeance had been hurried by my twofold escape, and there was to be no more dallying with the King of Terrors. The room had been square. I saw that the two iron angels were now acute, too consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant, the apparent apartment had shifted its form into that of a lozenge. But the alteration stopped not there. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red balls at my bosom in garment for the eternity of peace. Death, I said, any death, but for that of what the pit, you fool. Might I not have known that into the pit was the objection of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist his glow? For even that I could not withstand its pressure. And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge, with a rapidity that left me no time to contemplate. Its center, and of course the greatest width, came over me, the yawning gulf. I shrank back, the closing walls pressed relentlessly forward. At length, of my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony in my soul found vent in one loud, long, final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink, averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own, and I fell fainting into the abyss. It was there that General Lasalle, the French army, had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. Alright, kids. Now it's time for our last bit of the night. Let me put my book away, because this book does not have the ones that we need. So, I found it only fitting to end with Poe's most famous works. So for the last bit of tonight, we will be reading Lenore, and we will be following that up with The Raven. So, let us begin. Lenore. Ah, broken is the golden bowl, the spirit flown forever. Let the bell toll, a saintly soul floats on the Stygian river. In Guy de Vere hast thou no tear, weep now or nevermore. See, on yon dear rigid bier, low lies thy love, Lenore. Come, let the burial rite be led, the funeral song be sung, an anthem for the queenliest of death that ever died so young, a dirge for the doubly dead that in she died so young. Wretches, ye loved her for her wealth and hated her for her pride, and when she fell in her feeble health, ye blessed her that she died. How shall the ritual then be read, the requiem how be sung? By you, by yours, the evil eye, by yours, the slanderous tongue. That did to death the innocent that died, died so young. Peccavimus, but rave not thus, and let the Sabbath song go up to God so solemnly the dead may feel so wrong. Sweet Lenore hath gone before with hope that flew beside, leaving thee wild, dear child, that should have been thy bride. For her the fair debonair that now lowly lies, life upon her yellow hair, but not within her eyes, the life still there upon her hair, death upon her eyes. Avaunt to-nightly, my heart is light, no dirge will I appraise, but waft the angel on her flight with paean of old days. Let no bell toll, lest her sweet soul amid the hallowed mirth should catch the note as it doth float up from damned earth. To friends above, from fiends below, the indignant ghost is riven, from hell onto high estate, far upon the heaven. From grief and groan, the golden throne, beside the King of Heaven. Lenore. The Raven. Upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, someone gently rapping on my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping on my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. As distinctly as I remember the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor, eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books, secrece sorrow for the lost Lenore. The rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here, forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it, nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is, I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, and I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal dared dream before. The silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore!" Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul was within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. "Surely," I said, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see, then, what the threat is, and the mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment in this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many flirt and flutter in stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obstinate made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though my crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled in this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. We cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet blessed seeing a bird upon his chamber door. Bird or beast, upon the sculptured bust upon his chamber door, with such a name as nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only that one word, as if his soul that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther could be uttered. Not then feather he fluttered, until I scarcely more than mother. How their friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me. My hopes have been flown before. The bird then said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, I said, what it utters is only stock and store, not from some unhappy master who unmercifully disaster followed fast and followed faster till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of hope and melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancying to smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bust and door. And upon the velvet sinking I betook myself linking onto fancy, thinking, what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly ghost gaunt and ominous bird of yore meant croaking, nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, no syllable expressing, the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat diving with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining the lamplight gloated o'er. But those velvet violet lining and the lamplight gloating over o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfume from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee by the angels, he hath sent me respite, the nepathy from my memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff the kind of nepathy of forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, I said, thing of evil, prophet still, of bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here shore, desolate yet undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home of horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, I said, thing of evil, prophet still, of bird or devil, by heaven that bends above us, by God we doth adore, tell the soul of sorrow laden within the distant Aiden shall clasp saint and maiden whom angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whose angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shriek, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest night, in the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plumes token that lie on though thy soul hath spoken, leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust upon my door. Take thy beat from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And then the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and lamplight over him streaming. There was a shadow on the floor, and my soul from out the shadows that lie floating on the floor shall be lifted evermore. And with that, my dear listeners, ends tonight's Edgar Allan Poe stream. It was fun getting to do this. I don't read enough classic horror. I'm always doing internet stuff, so this is a true treat. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for sticking around and enjoying, and thank you for putting up with my many stumbles as I struggle to read poetry. Thank you, Jack. I got really excited for this. As you can see, I decorated intensively for this stream. I even broke into somebody's house. I mean, have you seen this shit? But we are done and dusted for the evening. It was fun. We are going to be back to normal business after today, so any streams go following. Probably will not have the standard spookiness that we've been accustomed to over the month, but that's fine. We're gonna be playing Puyo Puyo Tetris! Yes! I love Tetris. Anyways, I will see you guys next time. Thank you again for visiting. Thank you again for sticking by and enjoying yourselves. I really appreciate it. Happy Halloween! I know it's over. It's been over for about 2 hours on my end, but you know what? It's Halloween. Everybody loves Halloween. It might be November, but it's still Halloween in my heart, and everything's going to be on sale tomorrow, so now I get to go indulge in my shopping habit with Halloween decor. Goodbye. I will see you guys next time. I'll see you on, I think, Thursday night? Thursday night. Yep, that's it. Alright, I love you guys. Be good. Do good things. Take care. Bye-bye.